Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to Pontiac via Zoom. I'm going to be explaining why this Pontiac incinerator proposal is going to be very bad for the local economy, it's going to be bad for health, and it's going to be bad for farming. But let me bring up my PowerPoint presentation. Here we go. And with a bit of luck, that should be full screen. So yes. I'm a former director of Work on Waste USA. And here's the outline of my presentation. I'm going to start by explaining who I am, and then to provide the local arguments against building an incinerator in Pontiac, and then the global arguments against building incinerators anywhere. And finally, I'm going to talk about the way forward for Pontiac, a positive solution. I'm a retired professor of chemistry. I've been researching waste management since 1985, and it all began with the local incinerator battle in St. Lawrence County, northern New York. This issue has taken me now to 69 different countries. Between 1985 and 1995, Work on Waste USA helped communities in North America stop the building of over 300 waste-to-energy trash incinerators. Only one incinerator has been built in the United States since 1997. Canada's experiments with incineration have been very poor, e.g. the Plasco fiasco in Ottawa and the York-Durham nightmare. So here then are the local arguments against an incineration in Pontiac. A giant incinerator is not a solution for Pontiac's region's waste problem. It's just going to make things far, far, far worse. Pontiac produces 5,000 tons of waste per year. The proposal requires the importation of 395,000 tons of waste from outside Pontiac. And then this incinerator will burn 400,000 tons and produce 100,000 tons of ash each year. That is 20 times more ash than the trash you currently make. This is a non-solution. In short, the region is not solving its waste problem, but going into the waste business. A few individuals might make a lot of money in this, but it will ruin the image of Pontiac, reduce property values, threaten farming, and undermine hopes for genuine economic development for the region. It does make sense to produce dirty energy in Pontiac when Canada is exporting clean energy to the United States. Now the global arguments against building incineration anywhere. Number one, incineration is extremely expensive. Incineration is the most expensive way of handling waste. Incineration is the most expensive way of making electricity. Half the capital costs of a modern incinerator goes into the air pollution control devices. If you look at this diagram, all the features are in the dotted line to the right half of the diagram. That's air pollution control equipment. That costs half the amount of money you spend on this whole machine. The capital cost, 1,000 ton per day incinerator, which meets European standards, would cost about $400 to $500 million. Then to that, you have to add in the daily operation costs, the maintenance costs, and a profit margin. If it's being run by a private company, they're going to want to make profit. Now, all that money, huge amount of money, you're going to have to pay back. And typically it takes about 30 years to pay these loans back. Some places don't ever pay the loans back. It breaks them. So how do you pay off these massive loans? Well, basically, there are only two sources of income for this incinerator. Energy sales, and remember, Quebec has a surplus of good energy, and tipping fees. That's what customers or communities have to pay per ton of waste that they deliver to the facility. Typically, the tipping fee is the major source of income. The tipping fee increases as the waste becomes more toxic. Now, listen to this carefully. On a scale going upwards, the cheapest will be municipal waste, then commercial waste, then medical waste, and finally hazardous waste. Now, this is important because if the economics get very shaky, then the tendency will be to go for more toxic waste to get the money, to get a higher tipping fee. Now, for this huge outlay of money, very few jobs and small business opportunities are created for the enormous capital expense. Oh, yes, you'll get a lot of jobs building it for about a year or two, building it, construction jobs, all that kind of stuff. But in terms of after the thing is operating, very few jobs and very few positive economic developments. This beautiful incinerator in Brescia, Italy, this cost $400 million and has created just $80. Think of that, 80 jobs. Think of that, 80 jobs, and you paid $400 million investment for it. Incineration puts your taxes into machines, not people. Incineration puts your taxes into corporations, not community. Far more jobs and business opportunities are created with reuse, recycling, and composting, and the other steps involved in a zero waste strategy. Incineration is simply the wrong solution for the 21st century. Incineration doesn't make sense now. Our task is not to find better ways to destroy materials, but to stop making products and packaging that have to be destroyed. Waste is a design problem. If you build an incinerator in your community, you are advertising to the world that you were not clever enough politically or technically to recover your discarded resources. 4, despite the name waste to energy, incineration is actually a waste of energy. This is because you waste the opportunity to recover the embedded energy. That's the energy you've put into extracting raw materials, transporting them around the world, and manufacturing products from those raw materials. All of that, huge energy inputs. None of that energy comes back to you when you burn these products and packaging. None of it. Now, this is what a consultant, Franklin Associates, worked out in 1994. Recycling 1 ton of municipal solid waste saves nearly 17 million BTUs. Burning 1 ton of municipal solid waste, on the other hand, only generates nearly 5 million BTUs. So 3 times more energy is saved by recycling, reusing, composting than burning the waste. To put this into concrete terms, in this figure, in the green column, that's how much energy you save when you recycle those materials on the left. The yellow column is how much energy you produce when you burn a ton of those materials. And if you look for PET plastic, that's the plastic of water bottles. Look at that, 26 times more energy is saved by recycling a PET bottle compared to burning it. There are better alternatives to incineration. I've written a whole book about this, and I believe that some of you actually bought a copy. Now, in this book, I talk about the 10 steps to zero waste, and I'm not going to go into details here, but some of these are very familiar to you. Source separation, waste is made by these things. Source separation, door-to-door collection, composting, recycling, reuse and repair centers, zero waste research centers, economic incentives like the pay-as-you-throw system, the banning of single-use plastics, which is going on now around the world, and finally, with the residuals, a separation facility built in front of the landfill to separate out the organics and the toxics and stabilize the dirty organics. Such a facilities have been built in Nova Scotia. And then at the end, there is this different kind of landfill where you're dealing only with the residuals and the separated residuals. So what's the key difference between incineration and zero waste? With incineration, if you can't reuse it, recycle it, or compost it, something, you destroy it. That's what they do. So the people will say, oh, we agree with Dr. Connet. You reuse, recycle, compost. Oh, yes, we agree with all that. But there's always going to be stuff left over. And that's why we need to build an incinerator. And that's why we need to build one right now. Typical arguments. Not so. In a zero waste program, if you can't reuse it, recycle it, or compost it, you tell industry to stop making it. And that is what is happening right now all over the world with single-use plastics. So in summary, here's one page, summarizes zero waste. It's a combination of community responsibility and industrial responsibility. The community can do a lot, but the community cannot get to zero waste alone. We need industry's responsibility. So the community does the reduce, reuse, recycle, compost. Industrial responsibility, redesign. That's the fourth R. Reduce, reuse, recycle, and redesign. So basically, waste is a low-tech problem. You're not going to solve it with magic machines like incinerators, but with better organization, better education, and better industrial design. I've been promoting zero waste around the world since 1999, especially in Italy. I've actually spoken in over 300 cities in Italy. A delightful experience, I might say. It's been a success story. The anti-incineration movement, which I started to help in 1996, has morphed into the zero waste movement in Italy. And the end result is very impressive. 57 provinces out of 108 are now above 65% collection. At four best over 80%, and Treviso near Venice, with a population of 1 million, are over 80%. And 4,062 municipalities are over 70%, 1,581 municipalities over 80%, and 165 over 90%. And here's the point. Based upon the Italian experience, it's easier to do recycling in small communities, the zero waste, than in huge cities. The huge cities you have to divide up as if it was made of lots of villages. But for villages, rural areas, it's much easier. In a second meeting, I will be happy to go into the details of how a zero waste strategy can work in the Pontiac region. But today, the first order of business is to stop this incinerator from being built. Incineration produces a toxic ash that nobody wants. Now, for every 4 tons of trash burned, about 1 ton of ash or more is created. The ash is produced in 2 places, under the grate, the bottom ash, and in the boilers and the air pollution control devices. That's called fly ash. In other words, incineration does not get rid of landfills. You still need a landfill for the ash produced. So here's the diagram again I showed you earlier. The bottom ash collected under the grates, 90% of your ash, and fly ash collected from the air pollution control devices, 10%. Now the bottom ash is toxic and the fly ash is very toxic. These figures give you some indication. Take lead. The fly ash can be up to 17,000 parts per million of lead. Bottom ash up to 7,000 parts per million. The combined ash up to 5,000 parts per million. This is astronomical in terms of toxicity. Common sense tells you the better the incinerator gets at protecting the air from toxic metals and dioxin, the more toxic the fly ash is going to be. The idea of the air pollution is to capture this stuff, to prevent it going into the air. And if you're successful, then you've got to have toxic fly ash. Now, many countries treat fly ash as toxic waste. In Germany and Switzerland, the fly ash is put into nylon bags and placed in salt mines. In Japan, many of their incinerators vitrify the fly ash, make it into a glass, and some even vitrify the bottom ash to prevent leaching out of toxic metals like lead and cadmium. The problem with this approach is it uses up most of the energy that you're making in the incinerator. In Denmark, beautiful, clean Denmark, which I'm sure you'll hear about how wonderful its incinerators are, they send all their ash to Norway. Now, how sustainable is that, to build dozens of incinerators and all your ash goes to a different country? Where is your ash going to go in the Pontiac region? Are you going to hang on to it? You're going to bury it in Pontiac? You're going to send it to Ontario? You're going to send it to New York? You better find out. In the UK, they send their fly ash to hazardous waste landfills. And this one is in Gloucester, a beautiful part of the country. And those people in those houses are furious having that fly ash in their lives. In the United States, the bottom ash and the fly ash are mixed before testing. That's a real giveaway to the industry. And it's the combined ash which is sent to either regular landfills or monofills. In other words, incinerators don't get rid of landfills. Here is the ash landfill for Haverhill, Massachusetts. It's huge. Can you imagine that in your lovely Pontiac region? Incineration puts highly toxic substances into the air. We're talking toxic metals like lead, cadmium, and so on, new compounds like dioxins, furans, PCBs, and now more recently, people are very concerned about compounds containing the carbon-fluorine bond, PFAs, PFOSs, and so on. Now, this is an incinerator that I tried to stop back in the 1980s. We didn't succeed. They didn't listen to us. But now listen today, out of 351 air emission sources in New York, this incinerator is number one in dioxin emissions, number one in beryllium emissions, number two in cadmium, number two in lead, number two in mercury, number three in arsenic, and number three in chromium. These are highly polluting sources. Now, the major problem with dioxins and related compounds is that they're highly persistent and accumulate in the food chain. That you should be concerned. In the Pontiac region, how many cows do you have? Those cows really accumulate dioxin. And we did a study of this in 1986, published in 87. We showed that 1 liter of cow's milk gives you the same dose of dioxin as you would get if you breathe the air next to the cow for 8 months. So 1 liter of cow's milk is the equivalent of breathing the air for 8 months. In one day, and this is a German study, in one day a grazing cow puts as much dioxin into its body as a human being would get in 14 years of breathing. These cows and other grazing animals are vacuum cleaners as far as dioxin is concerned. So dioxin steadily accumulate in human body fat. The man cannot get rid of the accumulated dioxins in their body fat, steadily increase over a lifetime. But a woman can get rid of them by having a baby. So in the nine months of pregnancy, the dioxins move from the mother's body fat to the little fetus. And thus the highest dose of dioxin goes to the fetus. And then, to make the story worse, it goes to the newborn infant via breastfeeding. So dioxins interfere with fetal and infant development. They act like hormones. They disrupt male and female sex hormones, thyroid hormones, insulin, gastrin, and glucocorticoid. In other words, dioxins interfere with the mental and sexual development of the baby. And there's an excellent paper here by Linda Birnbaum, the retired head of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences in the United States. In short, dioxins are endocrine disruptors. And a whole book has been written about that called Our Stolen Future. Now, incinerators are poorly monitored. You're going to hear about this from Wendy and Linda. Dioxin traditionally regulators have relied on occasional once a year 6-hour test. This is a sick joke. It's a confidence trick played on communities. There's no way that these 6-hour tests represent the total emissions of an incinerator over a lifetime, over the year, because they miss emissions during startup, shutdown, and upset conditions. Now, some countries are now using continuous sampling. Instead of collecting a sample for 6 hours, they collect a sample for 4 weeks. This is the AMESA system. And even these are underestimating emissions. This is the AMESA system, commercially available. The company points out that over the past 10 years, it's discovered, especially during startup and shutdown periods, incinerators can put out 1,000 times more dioxin than during regular. So this is a very important study from Toxico Watch in the Netherlands. They looked at a brand new incinerator. This was built in 2011. It was considered to be one of the best incinerators in the world at the time. It had all the bells and whistles as far as pollution control is concerned. For the first time in history, this company, Toxico Watch, used 4-week samples, not 6-hour tests. And what they found, look at the green arrows. The green arrows are the results of the 6-hour test. This is the typical spot test. The red arrows represent the 4-week sampling. And you see that the 4-week sampling estimates 1,200 to 500 times more dioxin during these 4-week samples. As I said, a huge confidence trick to just rely on these 6-hour spot tests. But now, even better, the Toxico Watch has showed that the best way of monitoring the emissions from incinerators is through backyard chickens. A chicken really scavenges everything. They eat everything, snails and worms and insects and microbes and the soil itself. And so they bioaccumulate, biomagnify, and wonderful biomarkers then for dioxin, the chicken's eggs. So these are numbers. You'll see these are numbers of chickens' eggs produced near an incinerator, that incinerator in the Netherlands. And the regulated level is 1.7. That's what you want, 1.7 parts per quadrillion, picograms of dioxins per gram of fat. 1.7. But look at these, 6 or 7 times higher. And look at the location. The blue arrow, look at the tip, that's where the incinerator is. And you see where the high levels are within 5 kilometers of that incinerator. Shocking. And this Toxico Watch has now done similar studies in Slovenia, Spain, and Paris, France. And this made world headlines when in Paris they told people not to eat backyard chickens. I think it was in 408 municipalities in the Paris area. Now, here's a very important message. You need 3 things to protect the public from emissions from incinerators. You need strong regulations, you need adequate monitoring, and clearly we haven't had adequate monitoring, and you need tough enforcement. And I suggest to you that Canada, as far as incineration is concerned, has none of these things. It doesn't have the strong regulations, doesn't have adequate monitoring, and doesn't have tough enforcement. And I think Wendy and Linda will prove that. Then lastly, dioxins produce highly toxic nanoparticles. The most toxic emissions, like toxic metals and dioxins, are enriched on the surface of tiny particles. That's why they deposit as a function of surface area, and the smaller the particle, the greater the surface area. So the toxic metals and the dioxins, etc., on the surface of nanoparticles, there's a good article about this, but I won't go into that. There are no regulations and no monitoring for nanoparticles emitted from incinerators. We regulated incinerators at 10 microns and 2.5 microns, and the nanoparticles are way down to the left here, less than 1 micron. Now, we already know that in cities, that both sickness and death increase in cities with the higher particulate levels. And the smaller the particles in the cities, the stronger that relation between particles and health. So the nanoparticles are going to be worse. Nanoparticles are so small they can easily cross the lung membrane. Once into the blood, they are transferred to every tissue in the body. And here's a particle in the brain. A recent study in Montreal, I think it was 2020, showed that a 1-year increase in pollution exposure of 10,000 nanoparticles per cubic centimeter raised the risk of brain cancer by more than 10%. And this is the article. I urge you, the scientists amongst you, to get this article and read it and get in contact with Scott himself. Now, he says, anytime you burn anything, these small particles are produced. These particles are so small they can get into our bloodstream and into our brains. And once there, they can do significant damage. Weissenthal and his colleagues assessed the relationship between pollution and brain cancer in 2 Canadian cities. But they're typical of the pollution in many cities in the United States. So summarizing, incinerators and gasification plants convert thousands of tons of solid waste into trillions of very tiny particles, which are very difficult to capture, even in the most modern air pollution control, and can carry the most toxic substances known to man into every tissue in the human body. So I can't think of a way of delivering toxics from the stuff that we use every day to the bloodstream and the tissues in all our human beings than to build incinerators. It's incredible, but true. It's a disaster. But even if you made incineration safe, you would never make it sensible. It simply does not make sense to spend so much money destroying resources we should be sharing with the future. Incinerators produce sacrifice areas. It's not a coincidence that incinerators are often located near other undesirable facilities like nuclear power stations, medical waste burners, dump sites, etc. Once built, they attract projects to other people. They attract other dirty projects from other people, wealthy people who don't want to live with them. The situation generates a sacrifice area. Well, now for some positive news. The way forward for Pontiac. How do you stop this happening in Pontiac? Number one, polite people get poison. You gotta get noisy. Angry people get organized. A threatened community is a strengthened community. If people come together, that's what you gotta do. Come together, rich and poor together, or everybody together to fight this thing. Protect Pontiac as if your lives depended upon it, and they do. 2 ways Pontiac can deal with its waste problem. Now, remember what the problem is. Pontiac produces 5,000 tons of waste per year. One solution is to import 395,000 tons of waste from somewhere else and burn it in a 400,000 ton incinerator. The result, 100,000 tons of toxic ash, which nobody wants, which will have to go somewhere. Or you invest in a zero waste strategy with composting, recycling, reuse and repair, zero waste research, etc., 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 and that can get you up to 80% diversion. And that will leave you 1,000 tons of residuals to landfill. Which do you want? Which do you want? You certainly don't want this huge incinerator. So 3 final messages. Number 1, to citizens, don't let the experts take your common sense away. They will bring in all kinds of highly paid consultants who will tell you nothing to worry about. They are brilliant. You're stupid. This is a wonderful machine. To politicians, stop running to consultants and magic machines to solve your problems. Put your faith in people. Remember, trash is a low-tech problem. It's going to be solved with better education, better organization, and better industrial design. And finally, to activists, have fun. This is going to be a tough battle, but if you do it, if you come together to do it, you're going to have a much stronger community after the fight, than before. It will build your community. Remember, a threatened community is a strengthened community. Thank you very much.